And so if we want to speak meaningfully about the scientific world, we actually do have to make reference, at least, to immaterial facts about material objects. And I think that the Stoics might be quite comfortable with that. I don't want to put words in like Chrysippus' mouth or anything.
Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros, and today I have the fortune of speaking with Spencer Klavan, a return guest. And back in episode 58, we spoke about how to save the West. And since then, done many things, but amongst others, you have a new book called The Light of the Mind, Light of the World, How New Science is Illuminating Ancient Truths about God. So we'll start our conversation talking about that and see where it goes.
Terrific. So glad to be back. Thanks for having me, Caleb.
Of course. So one reading of modernity, perhaps, is that in a sense we could say the Epicureans won. So the point of life is to pursue a pleasant existence while we can. That's it. After that, everything's over. We're just atoms in a void. There's nothing after death. There's no overarching meaning to any of this. And what do you think about that framing? I think perhaps it aligns with your book well.
It's fascinating to see. So this book is, as you intimated, is a history of science from antiquity until the present day. And its aim is really to reset the narrative at a few key junctures. And I don't mean necessarily to reset the scholarly narrative so much as to reset the default public narrative. I feel that I and many others grew up with a really misleading picture of how science emerged from or in opposition to the Catholic Church or religious faith more generally. We got handed a story about the war between science and faith, perhaps. And certainly I was given the impression that religion was, at best, totally separate from scientific knowledge, that the hard and fast truths of science are radically distinct from, and the implication is usually better, or at least more certain than, the spiritual or immaterial truths articulated in philosophy and scripture. I would argue. I actually think science has done a number on philosophy as well in this way. And in telling that story, I came to grapple in a new way with what you've just said, which is that if you take the various Hellenistic schools, Stoicism obviously being one major one, and Epicureanism being one of its great rivals, and you think of which one of those two ways of looking at the world was perhaps most appealing to the populace more generally in the ancient world, I think there's a really good case that Stoicism, for the Romans at least, really squared with the common sense understanding of things, that there's an order to the universe, that it includes moral realities, that our task as humans is effectively to, if not embrace that moral order, at least resign ourselves to it and find some form of excellence or some appropriate kind of human flourishing in conforming ourselves with the logos that threads through the universe. And this Epicurean idea, which kind of pulls on older theories among, say, Democritus and Leucippus, that the world is made of these little tiny chunks of matter, of stuff, called atoms, because they're indivisible, and that those atoms obey numerical laws that produce all the other stuff that the Stoics were so interested in talking about, like virtue and so forth. And it's not that those things are totally meaningless for Epicureans, but they are products of a deeper reality, which is kind of value neutral and ultimately rather indifferent to human participation in the universe. So to the extent that moral teaching helps us to be at peace with this scenario, Epicureans are very on board with it. But they maintain that the only purpose point to finding that peace is for our own satisfaction, because there's nothing outside of a merely human structure that would endorse or even care about what we do ever. And so we kind of stand in the midst of this cosmic flow. We are part of this great cosmic flow of atoms, this multiverse that, in the end, operates according to numerically perfect mathematical laws that have nothing really to do with how we feel or what we want, or really the choices that we make at all. This was, I think, probably a more, it's fair to say, elite and recherche way of looking at the world. The ideal of the Epicurean is the kind of cultured or genteel garden where we retreat from public life and politics especially, and just attempt to attain what we might now call serenity. And that's not really, I mean, there are a lot of invectives. Cicero's come to mind, but there are a lot of invectives from the ancient world against Epicureanism as this kind of shabby or even self-involved, kind of entitled upper crust plaything of a philosophy. But in modernity, with the advent of the Newtonian revolution and with the gradual kind of sharpening of this physical picture of the world that Galileo was really the first to crack open in the modern world, you do start to get this idea that actually maybe the Epicureans were playing the long game here. Maybe they were onto something much more profound about the universe. And so you get expressly, you get neo-Epicureans starting to emerge, people like Pierre Gassendi and other sort of express atomists of the kind of early and middle modern period. People like Thomas Jefferson, who writes famously in a letter that he is now an Epicurean, and his sort of frenemy John Adams, who refers, I think, indirectly to Jefferson in saying all our philosophers are now Epicureans. He says, like, everybody, at least in the ancient world, they had sort of a variety of options to choose from, many of which were quite noble, including Stoicism. They weren't Christians, but at least, you know, there was some dignity in all of these different schools, except for Epicureanism, and that's what we've gone for. And there is a way in which it's now the case that whether we would really say this expressly or not, whether we know anything about Epicureanism or not, even if we pay lip service to certain ideals like justice, for instance, many people, I think, have an operating script about the universe that basically is Epicureanism, that Newtonian physics and then the atomic physics that kind of came in its wake can explain everything meaningful about the truth. And anything that we might impose onto that material world, including value judgments like good and evil, those are really purely human affairs. And if they help us to feel more serene, or to, if they make us feel good, then they're useful. But they don't correspond to any bedrock feature of reality. So yeah, I think Epicureanism has won in a big way. Although one coda that I'll add, and maybe this will spark another question, but I'll just note that there's an interesting kind of twist ending here, which is that although the Epicureans were the atomists of the ancient world, they were also the anti-determinists.
That's right,
because they believed in the swerve, right? So they had this idea that even at the atomic level and also at the human level, there's a certain room for randomness to intervene that enables things to be more than just mechanical, or more than just determinist. Whereas the Stoics, as I'm sure we'll get into talking about, had a more determined idea about fate and how the universe was kind of locked into a path or a natural trajectory. And it turns out in 20th century physics that actually that swerve idea, the idea that there's a little bit of indeterminacy or wiggle room in the world, has come back into fashion. It starts with the statistical mechanics of Ludwig Boltzmann and the the second law of thermodynamics, it moves on through the quantum revolution, and it has actually kind of undermined a lot of this idea that we are living in a machine, that our consciousness has nothing to do with reality, all that stuff. So weirdly, the Epicureans have been so endorsed that they might in the end become their own undoing, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's an important code, and we should get into that. But maybe useful to sketch out that first version of. I think that many people were taught something like you have philosophy, religion, and such, and then along came this picture of the world of that was given to us by science, which is a way of breaking the things down in the natural world into atoms, understanding physical laws such that we could manipulate the world and come to understand it as it really was, and expel all these ghosts, that were interfering with our picture of the world. There's nothing outside interfering with the weather or something like that. You can explain that with natural laws, and then moving that picture to the rest of the natural world, and in the end, ourselves, and seeing the entire cosmos as a kind of machine that can be understood in, if we understood these laws, we could understand it properly in a deterministic and predictable fashion. So, maybe say more about that general story, how that comes to emerge.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's really Galileo whose conflict with the Catholic Church serves as ground zero for this story. I actually think that it's fair to accuse many high school teachers in the US, at least, of giving the impression that science proper begins when Galileo breaks the bonds of religion. And we get a few little episodes of the conflict between Galileo and the Catholic Church, and those are often
Mm-hmm.
dramatized as a kind of morality tale about the liberation of scientific inquiry, real, true knowledge from mere prejudice or doctrine or dogma as represented by religious faith. And whatever else is true, that's certainly not how Galileo himself would have understood it, let alone the Cardinal Robert Bellarmine and the Catholic Church. But it is how various 19th century historians sort of portrayed this story, that mankind has a natural ability, the story goes, for knowing the world. We are endowed with reason. There are techniques we can use to attain true knowledge about the physical world, but that those techniques and that ability have been stunted, held in chains for hundreds and hundreds of years by religious superstition, which is mostly a tool for power, I think, is the
Sure, sure.
typical account.
Yeah.
And this was Voltaire's account. It was sort of Rousseauian idea as well. But Voltaire famously is when he says "écraser l'infâme," destroy the hateful thing. He's talking about the Catholic Church, and he's talking about it as a purely repressive force on truth, knowledge, raw, unrepressed, natural human reason. And leaving aside the fact that that hasn't gone so well for us in the wake of the Enlightenment, just looking at the actual history before the Enlightenment, um, I find this a really unsatisfying picture. First of all, because it obscures the first premise of science. It by proposing that you have this kind of spark of reason detached, that you're born into the world with a kind of pure access to truth. We lose sight of the fact that in order to study the natural world at all, and in order to believe in the validity of your experiments, in order to think, well, if I use mathematical reasoning to predict the motions of the heavens today, I'll be right tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you really have to have a few, if not doctrinal, then certainly metaphysical premises in place. You have to have a few premises that don't emerge naturally out of your contact with the world, but actually presuppose it, or rather stand behind it. One of them is the validity of human reasoning throughout all space and time. Um, if you think that we are just sort of randomly evolved hunks of atoms, then there's every reason to expect that our brains would be evolved to be able to handle our immediate surroundings, to reason about, say, lion attacks or finding water, these things that as animals we would have been able to figure out. But we have this very strange expectation of the universe, which is that it should be answerable everywhere to our reasoning. That is, if I can meaningfully hit upon a law to calculate the trajectory of Venus, which I have no reason for caring about at all, except my interest, then we expect the universe to answer back. We expect these things called numbers in our heads to work for describing the world. And when we press forward in that conviction, we often discover that we are right. In fact, this was kind of Newton's great achievement, was to expand the consistency of human reasoning beyond the orbit of the moon into the rest of the world. This is something very like, I think, what Stoics mean when they talk about the logos. And of course, the Christian idea of the logos is that it is, in some sense, God, that it has, of course, Stoics also think the logos is Zeus, although there are important differences, but we can get into them. The point I only want to make right now is that the whole idea of kind of science fighting against religion fails in the historical sense because science emerges out of certain religious or metaphysical convictions. And then once you actually get to Galileo, you're able to understand that, of course, this is not an irreligious man fighting against the church. This is a deeply devout believer arguing with other believers about what their responsibility to God is. And Galileo says at one point, God gave me my reason. He endowed nature with logic, and therefore he means for me, it would be an insult to him not to use it. This was effectively the point of view of every architect of the scientific revolution: Kepler, Newton, Tycho Brahe, you name it. They basically all thought something like this. And it was only sort of in the wake of those achievements, once the mechanical picture of the world started to work so well, that it became easy to kind of forget where all of this was founded. And you start to think, well, if we can explain the motions of Saturn in terms of mathematics, surely we can explain everything in terms of physical reasoning and mathematics. And that's kind of the later part of the story where this narrative starts to emerge that we later got. But it then gets kind of cast back into the past as an ideological project to delegitimize the very notion of kind of any sort of transcendent principle or anything metaphysical at all. So I do think that we grew up really with the false inheritance of that Enlightenment idea that it was all pure human reason, which finally one day became unfettered from the evil church, and then the dawn of truth
Right.
broke.
Yeah, you of course just have the historical reality that many of these scientists were religious, and then that
Yes.
philosophical point that well, I suppose there are two there. There's that idea that, look, our ability to come to learn about the world, there's that question, is that reliable? Or sometimes philosophers talk about our epistemic faculties or what have you. Is that the sort of thing that can produce truth? Or there's always that concern if you think they're just, we're machines produced by evolution, what's making our perceptive faculties reliable? There's that point. And I think also the point that if we're coming to learn about the world, there's that question, is there any order in the world to discover at all? And I think that's part of the scientific enterprise relies on the assumption that there is. And, as you say, that's something that Stoics and Christians can account for, but perhaps others cannot.
Absolutely. The notion of an implicit order, which is there waiting for us to discover it. This is something which the Epicureans are a little bit smarter than our modern sort of, I won't call them scientists because not all scientists think this way.
Of course.
Our modern materialists tend to take for granted that they can just go on expecting the universe to yield answers to our particular kinds of questions. For instance, there's currently a controversy in physics over how relativity and quantum effects can be reconciled. It's, all these questions about quantum gravity are akin really to the barrier that Newton faced between things below the moon and above the moon, that there's like a hitch or a snag in the fabric of our understanding. And Newton had a very good philosophical reason for believing that he could smooth that hitch out, that there was an underlying unity or a set of rules that he could use um, to unite these various regions of space. We have a similar problem. We're kind of at the very level of the very small. We have these two sets of rules for understanding things, and they don't seem to line up. And so we obviously need some other set of rules that incorporates both of these theories and accounts for their effects with one unified system. We are acting as if we expect to find such a thing. We certainly are not throwing up our hands. This is an object of intense, ongoing scientific research. But unlike Newton, we don't really have good reason to expect, if we don't believe in that logos or that order that's implicit in the universe itself, then we have no reason to expect that things will answer ultimately to our demand for unity.
Mm-hmm.
Epicureans would have said, I think, well, that's by design. There's no reason for you. You may just have hit up against a wall. You might have just reached the part of Star Trek where Q comes in and says, well, now I'm just changing the rules of physics. And why should your monkey mind understand it? This is, I think, the implication of the controversial Epicurean doctrine of multiple explanations, that there are certain things which we can, with our present data at least, we can see and account for in a bunch of different ways. And maybe all the explanations are true. Maybe only one is true, but we don't know which one. Maybe, maybe both explanations are part of some other larger explanation that's not accessible to us. And anyway, there are worlds out there where things don't work at all the way they work here on Earth. This is the doctrine of many worlds. So there's kind of one set of laws, the law of atomic motion, that's supposed to be true everywhere throughout the universe. But then those laws are supposed to be able to generate all sorts of things that maybe we are not equipped to understand fully or to account for, which, that's the real Epicurean position. And ultimately it would lead, I think, to despair, to just giving up on these projects if they don't yield enough understanding. Whereas the Stoic premise, the Christian premise, basically says just keep at it, which is kind of what we are actually doing in practice. We are just keeping at it because I think there's some instinct. It's not even, I don't think, even a leftover cultural instinct at this point. I just think it's how we humans, it's what we humans feel in our bones. We have this kind of conviction that the Stoic view is right, even though we may not say it that way to ourselves.
Right. So something I was wondering about is you have a little bit of a shift in some secular types, some popular narratives about science. I think maybe Sam Harris is the most well-known proponent of this, where the view is ordinary physicalism isn't enough. And we do need to make space for some phenomena, whether it's consciousness or morality, in a way that the current, I would say, simplified scientific paradigm, where you understand it purely as physical, the world in a purely physical, mechanical way, is not sufficient. We need more than that. What do you take about that story? Do you think that story, I would take it you say that story is moving in the right direction, but perhaps isn't sufficient. So yeah, I was curious to get your reaction against that as a foil.
Absolutely. Well, I do think it's interesting that this is creeping up on people. That's sort of dawning on a lot of different people that you're right. It is a simplified idea about what science says about the world, but it's also our working model. So I think even sophisticated scientists who might say otherwise, if really pressed to articulate things, have for a long time felt comfortable just getting by with a kind of good enough idea of the world that it is just bodies in motion. And that seems no longer to suffice for a lot of people. And it's kind of, I think, easy to see why. And some of the reasons are reasons that I focus on in my book, like that science itself now requires us to think in very different ways. If you want to have a hope of grasping quantum physics, you have to get that objects in motion picture out of your head. Now, the question then becomes, what do you replace it with? And that's, I think, what people like Harris and others are now grappling with. And this to me is of a piece with, in the analogous kind of political sphere, it's of a piece with people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali saying it may have been enough to get by on secular prejudice for a while, but intellectually, it really doesn't track down to the bottom. And so if we want to preserve our whole civilization, but especially, natural rights and the idea of human dignity and all that, we're really going to have to take a serious, hard look at the idea of a creator. And that's kind of, as I understand it, why Ali converted. And it's also an argument that Tom Holland makes in another form in the book Dominion. So there are all sorts of people, not just in the scientific arena, who are coming to grips in a more real way than they have before with the inadequacy of a materialist point of view. And to me, is any motion in that direction is salutary and good. I think I find it a little bit touching, and maybe you'll relate to this as a fellow scholar of ancient ideas. I find it touching that, having spent the better part of a lifetime paying no attention to these ultimate questions of purpose and metaphysics and the transcendent, of course, people who don't reach out for any kind of help from previous kind of treatments of these subjects are just going to stumble across the same old furniture. It would be sort of like if I had lived my whole life believing there's only spirit, and tomorrow I thought, actually, there's this thing called matter. And instead of brushing up on Newtonian mechanics, I just sort of tried to figure out like how things move on my own steam. And I'd probably come up with something that looks like, if I were lucky, I might arrive at like empedocleanism, right? I would arrive at like, there's sort of these four elements, and that would be just a silly way to go about things. Instead, I could say, oh, wow, there's a whole rich literature kind of available for thinking about things that can warn you against common errors and missteps and send you down better paths. And that's how I understand scripture really to function. It's a record of sort of the most trustworthy ideas in this domain, and also a manual and a warning against a lot of the common pitfalls, putting your faith in the weather, in the elements, putting your faith in other forms of higher powers that are not actually the highest possible power and that can't be consistent. And then if you sort of broaden that research to include like Thomas Aquinas and some of the medieval theologians, you really will have a pretty good backing in like, okay, what are some of the best options for thinking through the immaterial and for dealing with guys like Harris just strike me as weirdly not doing that, or not that weird. I sort of know why they're like allergic to it, but like they're stumbling around in the dark over old idea. Like maybe it's all in my head. Like maybe it's all a narrative. Maybe it's all a story. It's like you can find this in Heraclitus. You can find some of this stuff, and it's been exploded multiple times, and it has caused problems. And basically, if I had to state the argument of this latest book in one sentence, it would be like, why not try the book of Genesis? Like while you're testing out possible frameworks for interpreting what science seems to be telling us about human consciousness, about its kind of constitutive role in reality. Like, Genesis has a pretty good track record for shaping and guiding people's thought in this domain. And it actually works better than simulation theory or multiverse theory or whatever else you're going to come up with just by trying to kind of reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to make a distinction that you do in the book, which is when someone hears, check out Genesis, they might say, wait, is this guy going to tell us that the earth is,
Yeah.
6,000 years old?
Yeah.
So is that what you're telling us?
It is not. And yeah, this is a funny part. This was actually a sensitive part of the book for me to write because there are really two intended audiences for this book.
Mhm.
And I sort of say this, that there are those who have come to believe or been sold the idea that if they want to be serious thinkers, they have to um, pay no attention to anything other than kind of the material laws of science.
Mhm.
Um, and we've sort of been talking about that element of the book this whole time. But there's also another side to this, which is my fellow believers who feel that science is a danger to their belief, and that because it has so often been presented, science has so often been presented as hostile to religion, antithetical to religion. Maybe people have argued that science has disproven God. Um, Christians and believers more generally have had a number of, I think, unhelpful reactions to this, admittedly quite aggravating and to many offensive, claim on the part of science. But people have said, well, no, actually, the Bible has a better record of like material fact
Mhm.
than science, or science is deceptive and those who go in for it are seduced, so we just shouldn't pay any attention to it at all. And you know I am open to and happy to entertain anybody's argument that the world really was made in 7 24-hour days. But it's certainly not my position. And it also, this is more important than what my position is. It also doesn't seem to me in the slightest to be necessary in order to make a robust defense of and case for scripture. In fact, I think the insistence on a 7-day creation is in itself a reaction to the scientific revolution, which accepts the crudest possible premises of materialism. If you go back before the scientific revolution, there are, of course, people who thought that Genesis meant 7 24-hour days, but there were also people like
Mhm.
Augustine, who's certainly not a heretic. People like Augustine who said it doesn't make sense to think of this in terms of human perception, because this is a description of the world before there was human perception. So when the text says days, it must be using human experience after the sun was made to talk back into pre-human experience from the perspective of the Godhead. This is also John Milton's kind of theory of the case when he has Raphael come to Adam and tell the story of the war in heaven before the creation of man. He says, this all happened in a kind of spiritual space, but I'm going to tell it to you as if it were a physical army of people, because that's your mode of perception. Like, you see the world this way. So I'm going to use this language in a kind of allegorical sense. Um, I wouldn't say that this is the proper mode of interpretation for every kind of
Sure.
scripture. I think there's obviously parts of scripture that are clearly historical in our particular sense, that they describe material events and, state dates of political happenings and so forth. But as we know, the Bible has many, many genres in it and many modes of speech, each of which is differently appropriate for different subject matters. And when the scientific revolution installed the idea that all truth has to be materially factual or else it's not truth at all, many Christians, I think, kind of accepted this premise and then fought the battle on those terms, so that it became the case that only a 7-day interpretation of Genesis really counted as orthodoxy because it took more faith to believe and it was more supposedly rigorous. I think we should have gone almost in exactly the opposite direction, which is to reject the premise out of hand and recover the dimension of our tradition, which does stretch back all the way to the early church, in which questions of material time actually look different to the author of Genesis than they do to the researchers of science, because they're asking different questions, or perhaps they're asking the same question in slightly different terms. So no, I think that actually there are periods in the current cosmological account of deep time, like for instance I think it's 360,000 years during which the universe is invisible to us before light can break free of matter and the universe can become what's called transparent. I think that corresponds quite neatly to the first day of creation, that you have this kind of cutoff period where before this everything is darkness. After this, there's evening and morning invisible stuff. And yeah, from a human perspective, it looks like that period was about 360,000 years long. The scripture describes it as one day, which is either totally incompatible with science or is a poetic language or an allegorical language for describing exactly the same thing that science is mysteriously, quite eerily, the same thing that science is describing. I prefer to read the Bible in a way that actually conforms miraculously to what science uncovers, than to insist that the Bible is just kind of a form of rival science. So no, people who are worried that this book is going to argue them into
Sure.
7-day creation, like that's really not my technique, and I don't think that that's a wise way of approaching this question.
Right. Yeah, I suppose you have that. There's that idea of many claims the scientific enterprise concern just material facts. And then I think the question is, if you feel like your tradition is being challenged, does your tradition have a claim that go beyond material facts, or is there some way to make sense of that? Or do you want to sort of make the dispute at the level of material reality? And just to flesh that out a little bit more, and traditionally, Stoics, they rejected atomism, of course. So, and perhaps you could say the Stoics had something that was closer to field theory type versions of physics, and that might be a possible move you could make if you were a traditional Stoic uncovering these newest scientific discoveries, and you might say, yes, this is confirming my view about Stoic metaphysics. The physics aligns perfectly. Alternatively, you might make the claim that the Stoic view perhaps had more to do with how we conceive of material bodies at all, or something of this sort. And it doesn't have much have to do with scientific mathematical formula or natural laws or something of this sort. So I think sometimes that's a useful way to think about one's strategy when facing these kinds of questions.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I think that the the strategy of contesting material facts is perfectly legitimate if you think you have other material facts to show.
Sure.
And there are some areas, right, where I do think this is true. So, for instance, in the case of evolution, I am myself pretty content if it turns out that the canonical description of human evolution is true. It won't sort of shake my faith because of something I say in the book, which is at some point human consciousness came into being, and at that point there was a sort of formal break, that is a chasm of division between what went before and what went after. And it doesn't really worry me sort of how that came about, how God brought that about. So this is not for me, a high stakes question, really. But I do think that people who challenge the current account of evolution have a lot of very legitimate questions to raise. Like, there does not, for instance, seem to me to be enough time from our best estimates of how speciation works, it seems as if the current model of how long the world has been around doesn't leave enough time for the degree of complexity that we observe in evolutionary uh, organisms to have evolved, to have come about. Also, synthetic chemists point out that even when they take what we currently understand to be the ingredients for life and provide them with optimal conditions for spontaneously generating DNA, coming together to make something that we would call alive, we cannot make them do it. So, this idea of like a primordial soup of lipids and nucleotides kind of eventually just happening to bang up against each other in just the right combination to form the first amoeba or whatever, that also seems to have some problems. So I'm very comfortable raising those objections, and I'm even comfortable with people raising them out of certain philosophical motivations, even if those motivations don't color the way that they perform their research, right? You might start out in your private study saying, this whole this whole neo-Darwinian materialism seems really godless and disgusting to me. I'm going to set out to refute it, and I'm going to do that by a lifetime of research in the field of synthetic chemistry. That's your prerogative, as long as what you're doing in your laboratory is actually synthetic chemistry, and the questions that you're raising are legitimate questions in the terms that science has set out. On the other hand, if what you're saying is simply, the Genesis account is different, would lead us to different material conclusions than the scientific record. Therefore, I reject the scientific record and accept the Genesis account. I don't think that's an effective or appropriate strategy. And on the other hand, I do think it's effective and appropriate to say, like, based on our best scientific research, this seems to be how the world looks to human consciousness, materially speaking. There are a range of possible interpretations of that data, as there always are. Any data has a range of possible interpretations. What would be the Genesis interpretation? In other words, what would be the interpretation that takes Genesis as true in some bedrock sense, as true in some spiritual sense, and then uses it as a filter to select between multiple possible interpretations? I think that's probably a wiser thing. So then if you're a Stoic, right, and you have perhaps something like field theory as your picture of the universe, but you also are forced to accept the existence of atoms, you might have reason, I think, to kind of use your pre-existing Stoic commitments to speculate or hypothesize about what's underneath the atoms. And if you did that, you would be like up onto something quite real about how Einstein himself sort of arrived at his ultimate reconciliation of mechanics with Maxwell's theory of light. So yeah, I think that our wisdom traditions can guide us in that sort of way, but I think we go on the defensive too easily and therefore engage in kind of tendentious or bad scientific arguments.
Yeah. It's a tricky issue. So how do you see Stoicism? Interesting. So I was thinking about Stoicism and your book. Stoicism rejects this picture of the world as a machine,
Mm-hmm.
which you do as well. It's complicated both for philosophical reasons and now scientific reasons. But it does accept that the world is determined, right? It does accept that the world is largely made up of bodies, although that picture gets complicated relatively quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I should say, it is made of bodies. The picture gets complicated quickly by the ideas of subsistence and so on, and also the fact that you have the logos and everything. This idea of the active principle giving breath, giving energy, giving life to the world. So you have some elements of the machine picture, if you will, the mechanical picture, determinism, materialism, mixed in with these philosophical ideas about providence, teleology. So I wonder if you could comment on how you see that interacting with the core narrative of the book.
Yeah, I find it really intriguing. I mean, as you indicate, there is what I was taught in grad school to call a corporealism in Stoicism, and there was a distinction made, which I always found uh, dubious but potentially useful, between corporealism and materialism. I
Hmm.
think because materialism would be the strict "there are only objects" sort of proposition, whereas the Stoic proposition, as I understand it, is there are somata, there are bodies, but there are also things like lecta. There are four at least categories of kind of incorporeal things, which are understood, I think, to subsist in or pertain to arrangements of bodies, activities of bodies. And actually, I think that idea that there are maybe even emergent properties of bodies is something like how I, in the book, argue we should understand things like forces. So we have a, I think, material mistake that we make, which is that we think if we're talking in terms of things like forces and energy and momentum, then we are still in comfortably in the realm of matter. We're still talking about things. Um, but as William of Ockham, of all people, pointed out when the idea of momentum or impetus was first getting going, we really have departed actually from material, pure materialism the minute we admit that there is such a thing as force or gravity, or even, I mean, since gravity is now kind of understood as a property of space time, we might refer to things like energy, right, which is supposed to be kind of one of the fundamental ingredients of things. But energy, being the capacity to do work, is an abstraction that
Hmm.
it can only be explained in terms of other abstractions. And so, if we want to speak meaningfully about the scientific world, we actually do have to make reference, at least, to immaterial facts about material objects. And I think that the Stoics might be quite comfortable with that. I don't want to put words in like Chrysippus' mouth or anything, but I think that if you can have a sayable, which is this idea or this thing that attaches to these material arrangements of letters in the techne periphones, in the sort of like linguistic theory of the Stoics, um, then I don't see why you can't have something like force or momentum that emerges out of or subsists within um, the relations of bodies. Um, it's not quite the account that I would give. That's not my metaphysics, but I think it is like a pretty robust metaphysics, and it allows for, indeed, ultimately leads to, and I think is designed to support the conclusion that logos is a fundamental or the fundamental principle in reality, um, which I would say is quite close to my own view that mind is an indispensable principle of reality. It's impossible to do away with some sort of conscious perception or observation if you want even to give a rigorous account of matter, and that
Hmm.
matter, in fact, is born in a communion between what is external to mind and mind itself. Where I part ways with the Stoics here is not actually in the belief of in their beliefs about the logos, but in the thorny question of whether the logos is coterminous with the corporeal universe. So I think that because I mean, I think this is the ancient Christian dispute with the Stoics.
Right, right.
I'm not really saying anything new, but just that um, Christians are committed to an idea that the logos or the divine mind um, extends infinitely beyond the world of matter. And I don't think Stoics are ready to accept anything extending beyond the world of matter, but rather they sort of want things to inhere in the world of matter that are not themselves material. But it's I think it's actually it's held up better than kind of crude Epicurean atomism, especially because of this idea that mind is an essential ingredient of reality. That seems to be right.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's probably one of the crucial areas of agreement is that, the Stoics thought we had this, divine spark within us, and that was that ability to reason. And that's what was shared between ourselves and God understood as what animates the whole cosmos, and descriptions, purely material descriptions that leave out that fact are going to be missing an essential aspect of reality. Now, the traditional Stoic view might be challenged by what you said in the very first answer to the question about swerves of atoms and
Mm,
such. The deterministic picture is certainly, at least, has some question marks around
yeah.
it. And then of course there's that dispute between Stoics and Christians about the nature of the logos.
I think
But
that
yeah,
the
yeah,
determinism part is really intriguing because of the weird kind of bait and switch that happens between Stoicism and Epicureanism in the modern day. So I come back a lot to, I want to say it's in Alexandria of Aphrodisias, this Chrysippan idea of the cylinder rolling down a hill. And this is sort of supposed to be somehow supposed to be a picture of our nature, that we do, we are accountable for our actions, but we don't really kind of choose them among an array of other possibilities so much as we live into the logic of what we are and what our environment is. Um, and I am a I feel that questions of determinism and free will in eternity, in the grand design, are a bit outside of the purview of human reasoning. I actually think that when people start to try and think about this from the perspective of outside of time, it becomes very, very difficult or even impossible, because we are within the system that we're trying now to comprehensively sort of assess. Um, I think that everybody is struggling with the fact that we experience ourselves to make choices. If there's anything immediate about our experience, it's that we could do this, we could do that, but we decide what we're going to do. Um, and if there is an underlying other truth that's not evident to us, which invalidates that sensation, um, we end up in a real pickle, because everything else that we currently believe to be true on the basis of what seems like immediate sort of testimonial from our experience is now also called into question. And this is not a problem that's unique to sort of the determinism argument. It's also a problem that's unique to science as well. Science both demonstrates that things are not as they appear to our naked eye, but also proposes to restrict our knowledge to that which can be directly observed by our senses. And this is like kind of a paradox, unless you think that we are, through our senses, accessing some grander logic and design. Um, the Epicureans, on the other hand, just want to kind of give a material cause for our experience of choice. And this they do by way of the swerve, or at least that's what Lucretius attributes to Epicurus.
sure.
Um, and something like the swerve seems to be true about atoms. This is kind of a really unsettling discovery in the late 1800s, that, for instance, the increase of entropy over time isn't so much an ironclad determinist law as it is a highly, highly, highly probable thing. So that by the time you've had as many collisions of atoms as there are, even in a very small box of gases, the alternative, which is that more order would emerge out of chaos spontaneously, just doesn't happen, because you've had so many events that those events are all kind of compounding in to make it functionally impossible. Um, and this is sort of like what David Hume was getting at, I think, with a lot of his arguments about physics. And I do think it is suggestive that um, our experience of having an effect on things that we can voluntarily sort of generate is at least corresponds to something very deep about the universe. Um, but yeah, so I guess I'm a little unsure that I understand the Stoic view on choice well enough to say whether it comports with what we're finding out about determinism or not. My suspicion is that it might be best to understand the Stoics in terms akin to what you were saying earlier, that like this is not so much a material description. The cylinder rolling down a hill is not like a physical description of how things work so much as an image for conceiving of how our unchosen attributes, our nature and our nurture kind of contribute to shaping our what we experience as choices.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think probably a Stoic should say, at least ancient Stoics probably did have the traditional, right, deterministic view, and there were a number of moves they made to protect free will, events being co-fated, and so on, that they intended to not reject determinism as such. So perhaps there's always that move that maybe we have indeterminacy at the micro level, but at the macro level, everything is determined. And perhaps the Stoics can say something there. But there's also the risk that does providence, a Stoic picture of providence, does that depend on determinism? Or perhaps so, perhaps not. I think that's another open question we're thinking through.
This is where Christians, I think, do face some of the same questions, and famously disputes within the church have really kind of circled around this. Whether or not, for instance, once you're saved, do you have no choice in the matter? Is it just the pure action of the Holy Spirit, and now all the choices that you make are bound to tend you in one direction? There's a Charles Spurgeon sermon, I think it is, where he talks about the idea of free will and the idea of providence being parallel lines that meet at eternity. And I'm partial to this idea that these two ways of looking at things may actually both be equally true. I will say that as a Christian, it is, and this is actually one of the major advantages of looking at the Logos as being outside of time and space, as well as embodied within it. As a Christian, it's possible to conceive of God, if not to visualize him doing this, then at least to conceive of God standing outside of the whole timeline of material events, including choices that he knows we will make, and arranging the universe around those choices. So that would be sort of my response to it, although I know that's probably not what the Stoics would say.
Right. I do like the thought that there's some way of reconciling free will and determinism ultimately. And I think you have both, in an intuitive sense, perhaps, is that as many great moments in one's life, good moments in one's life, it felt like they were the product of free choices, and yet things were fated. And I think that's there's something to that.
Yep, no question.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for joining.
It was a delight. Thank you, Caleb, for having me.
Thanks for listening to Stoa Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.